Battles are emotional things. The sheer momentum of a charge can push men to extraordinary feats of valor, can drive an enemy into retreat and then break them into a full rout. But that feverish high, that euphoria that fills men's hearts when they are on the winning side of a battle, that can be taken away in an instant, and the icy grip of fear and panic threatens to overwhelm even the bravest men. The combined forces of Guardsmen, Imperial Knights, and Lamentor Space Marines had thrust deep into the Tyranid forces that besieged Dawn Citadel, advancing behind a rolling barrage that broke up the dense Tyranid formations. There was a palpable rush, a heat, a fire that drove men and machine forward. The infantry advancing in the center of the column and armored vehicles along the outside protecting their flank. However, in the midst of this glorious advance, the guns enabling it fell silent, and the Imperial forces found themselves immensely overextended in the midst of the Tyranid swarm. Even the Ogryns seemed to feel hope die in their chests, though none of them really understood what this strange feeling was or why they felt it. When a man feels hope inside him die, he is struck down to his core, stripped of everything. The only two things that remain are his discipline and his training. In this moment, you either panic and die, or you make the enemy pay dearly for every life they take. Smash the bad bugs! With that, the wave of flesh crashed into the wall of armor protecting the infantry. Hormagaunts and Termagaunts tried to swarm between the gaps of the vehicles and quickly overwhelm the defenders. Lamentors leapt into the gaps first, hacking with chainswords into the relentless hordes. Men of Krieg were quick to support, surging behind the Space Marines and trying to plug the gaps with their bodies. Those who were not marching into the meat grinder were firing at any bioforms that climbed on top of the vehicles. A few Kriegers tried to climb atop the vehicles themselves to force the Tyranids back, but they were immediately shredded by countless bioweapons erupting from the horde. Fletcher began directing Ogryns to help fill the gaps as well. They were large and powerful, and just about as durable as one of the Space Marines. Ogg and Gus began to move forward with the others, but Biff pulled them back.
No, we gotta kill the big ones.
Just as Biff said this, a Carnifex emerged from the horde and let out a keening scream as it began to tear into the Chimera. For the Emperor! The three Ogryns fired their las cannons into the Carnifex. Given the beast's size and the fact that it was nearly point-blank range, the Ogryns had no trouble finding their mark. One shot tore a large hole through the creature's chest, blasting apart its bioweapon. The second blew off one of its legs, and a third struck it right in the face, causing the beast to tumble back into the mass of its comrades, giving the Ogryns a moment to shove the damaged Chimera back into place. Bolter fire raked over the top of vehicles, ripping apart bioforms supported even further by the trio of Imperial Knights standing above the fray, firing their autocannons into the teeming masses of Tyranids. These knights quickly became the target for Tyranid artillery, and their ion shields flashed white with each attack they absorbed. The situation was utterly untenable. The Tyranids were now flanking into the mountains. Lamentor scouts countered them as best they could to keep them from reaching the exposed knights. Ogg fired again and again into the largest creatures he could see. Wherever the las cannons fired, at least one of the blasts hit their targets, and then the focused fire from other units would help finish them off. But every time the larger bioforms appeared, the smaller bioforms would advance. The men of Krieg died in droves trying to fill the gaps. Eventually, that duty was given over to the Lamentors and the Ogryn, who could last a little longer in melee with these creatures. But even these brave warriors could not fight off the waves forever. One of the knights suddenly succumbed to the relentless barrage of artillery fire. His ion shield failed, and his rugged metal body became pockmarked with acid burns and wriggling bioweapons. He stood for a moment before a powerful blast of bioplasma bore a hole neatly into his cockpit, and he tumbled back into the mountain, the spirits of both man and machine extinguishing. Ogg could feel that he was nearly out of power packs for his las cannon. He could see the Ogryns of his squad pressing as hard as they could into the gaps. He watched as lines of crimson appeared over their bodies, and their hearty forms were slowly eaten away by acid. One by one, the Ogryns slowly fell. The Primaris Lamenters lasted a bit longer, but even they could not fight forever. The defenders became fewer and fewer, and Fletcher stepped up with his Ogryns and leapt into the fray, slicing through bioforms. He and Bill held off a trio of Tyranid warriors. Bill pounded away with his fists and his ripper gun as Fletcher dodged this way and that. These things were incredibly fast, and the Commissar was avoiding their slashes by the skin of his teeth. Bill crushed the head of one of the warriors as Fletcher buried his chainsword into the chest of another. But just as they achieved this small victory, the Commissar was suddenly pierced through the chest by the mantis-like claws of a lictor that had been hiding amidst the swarm. His body was yanked towards the enveloping horde. Bill hesitated as his commander suddenly vanished and was swarmed under by the living carpet of blades and teeth. Even as he was pulled out of sight, Commissar Fletcher was defiant to the last, pulling the pin on a frag grenade and shouting back, "My blood is the Emperor's currency! May it be well spent!" There was a blast in the midst of the horde, and suddenly there was no one protecting the gap the Commissar had occupied. Biff dropped his las cannon and pulled out the adamantium rod that Fletcher had gotten them to use as melee weapons.
Leave the cannons for the little uns. It's time for smashing sticks. Hyah!
Biff launched himself forward. Gus and Ogg followed behind him, wielding their cudgels fiercely and cracking through the chitin of the bioforms with each swing. Ogg had been holding back. He'd been firing the Emperor's gun and doing a good job like he was supposed to. But now it was time for him to smash the bad bugs, to make them pay for taking his commissars and his Ogryn friends away.
For Gallus! For Fletcher! For my Ogryn friends!
The Ogryn trio was quickly joined by a handful of lamenters, including Sergeant Lazarus.
For the Emperor, brothers, each moment we live is a moment of relief for the defenders of Dawn's Citadel.
With the armored vehicles being shredded to pieces, breaks along the line began to occur. Imperial forces had been cut off from the rest of the army that was still positioned in the mountains. They began to collapse into pockets of resistance centered around tight knots of lamenters or around the feet of Imperial knights. Biff, Gus, Ogg, and lamenters fought with every fiber of their being, forcing a stalemate against the endless tide of enemies. Gus caught a flesh borer to the face, and he cried out in pain and anger. A scything limb knocked him from his feet. Sergeant Lazarus fired into the swarm to drive back Gus's assailants, but the horrible, boring creature had slipped up Gus's nose and burrowed its way deep into his skull. He twitched for a moment, and then lay still. Biff quickly picked up his fallen comrade's cudgel and began swinging two weapons into the fray. Sergeant Lazarus looked like a whirlwind of death, making precise strikes honed by years of training indoctrination. Biff was like an enraged grox that had eaten about a dozen doses of Frenzon. He crushed and smashed and seemed to shrug off blows to his own body, only answering them with bellows and headbutts. It was then that it came. A towering form emerged from the swarm. 4 bladed limbs grew from its terrible shape as it dwarfed the mighty Ogryns, standing more than twice the height of Ogg. The thing was nearly the size of the Imperial Knights. It had come to deliver the killing blow, to end this pocket of resistance. A hive tyrant. It gave a ululating cry and pierced through the cacophony of battle before it dove at the remaining defenders. Biff ran forward to meet this creature. He swung his 2 adamantium rods at the thing. It was too lightning fast and effortlessly parried the powerful swings with 2 of its claws. The others tried to slash into the bonehead. Ogg managed to catch one on his own rod, while Sergeant Lazarus caught the other on his chain blade. The beast brought its great head down on Biff, biting deep into his left shoulder, and with one yank tearing the bonehead's arm free. Biff roared in defiance as he charged anew. The tyrant was about to slice through the bonehead like butter. But 3 blasts from the las cannons that were now being crewed by Kriegers struck the hive tyrant's body, causing it to stumble backwards by the force. The creature focused its psychic blast at the heavy weapons team, and they burst apart from the force of the raw energy. Biff took advantage of the hive tyrant's divided attention and managed to strike at its head at the absolute limit of his reach. The creature hissed as it simply pulled its limbs towards itself, slicing through Biff, causing rivers of crimson to run from him. The bonehead hit the ground. Sergeant Lazarus and his lamenters tried to use their bolters and chainswords against this creature, but they simply could not do enough damage to its thick carapace. 1 slice. 1 lamenter. Another slice. Another marine. Tears were streaming down Ogg's face as he grabbed a piece of wreckage from a nearby chimera. The enraged Ogryn swung several tons of ruined vehicle into the hive tyrant, staggering it. Sergeant Lazarus ran forward and leapt through the air, burying his blade into the creature's neck. Ichor flowed freely from the wound. But the cursed thing would not die. With 2 slashes, the tyrant separated Lazarus's arms from his body, slicing through ceramite as if it was nothing. It bore down on Ogg next, ignoring the Kriegsmen that tried to slow its advance, swatting them away effortlessly.
For the Emperor!
With 2 more strikes from the monster, Ogg felt himself tumble backwards. He was confused because he was no longer swinging the chimera wreckage around. His left arm fell to the ground, and Ogg could feel himself tumbling backwards as his left leg gave way too. The beast stood over the Ogryn in triumph and let out its horrifying cry. Miracles are rare things. Saint Celestine, or the Sanguinor, or the Legion of the Damned appearing at the times of most dire need are wondrous occasions. But these are the most rare of miracles. The more common miracles are the ones which men perform every day when they give everything they have, and when there's absolutely nothing left. The Emperor provides that which men cannot. The defenders of Dawn Citadel had not been idle. Their commanders recognized that the combined relief force was trying to connect with the forces defending the sacred fortress. With the Tyranids dividing their attention between the newly arrived force and the ongoing assault on the Citadel's void shields, the servants of the Emperor saw their chance to take a risk and try to break the siege once and for all. Just as the relief force had cleaved its way through the teeming swarm, so the army within Dawn Citadel come out to meet them. But there was something different about the Citadel's advance. So when Ogg fell backwards, and the hive tyrant was about to extinguish his life, it was then that they came, flying on majestic steeds of shining metal, wearing golden auramite, wielding great interceptor lances. The custodies of the Emperor came and fell upon the hive tyrant like a thunderbolt, piercing the great beast many times. Ogg's eyes struggled to focus as his vision swam. He tried to move, but was taken by darkness. When Ogg regained consciousness, he found himself in an unfamiliar room. Everything was white. The Ogryn's weapons and armor were nowhere to be found. Ogg looked down at himself, wearing an enormous medical gown. He could see that his arm and leg had been replaced by augmetics. Ogg's head hurt a bit too, as he brought his hand up to feel some kind of metal plating that had been implanted in his skull.
You're finally awake.
Ogg looked over to see Sergeant Lazarus lying in the bed next to him, also out of his power armor, and sporting 2 new augmetic arms.
It appears the Emperor isn't quite done with us yet.
Normally, being in such a confusing situation would have overwhelmed Ogg, and might have caused him to panic. However, he somehow was able to manage his emotions and think a little bit about what might have happened.
Where am I?
Sergeant Lazarus's answer was interrupted as a familiar figure entered the room. In a medical facility in Dawn Citadel, where you have undergone extensive surgery to replace your damaged limbs. Also, you have gone through the biochemical Ogryn neuroenhancement process. Congratulations, Bonehead Ogg. Walking in on a pair of his own augmetic legs was Commissar Gallus.